Morning, everyone. I'm Bart Challis from Forest Growers Research, and today I've got the opportunity to talk with you about some of the activity that we've been working on around specialty species and contingency species. So I guess I'd like to start by recognising that the topics of specialty species and contingency species are large and complicated. There's lots of existing knowledge and there's been lots of historical activity. The purpose for FGR is not to derive solutions, but to support progress to the science and innovation strategy. In doing that, what we've attempted is to revisit the choices and the challenges that we face, tap into the knowledge and the experience that already exists to identify areas where research may be needed, and to identify and create opportunities for potential co-investment. Firstly, I guess it's worth reminding people that the Science and Innovation Strategy is a key document that's used by both the FRC and subsequently FGR to identify areas for priority investment where research can make a difference. In the strategy, there's a specific acknowledgement that species diversification, as well as ensuring contingency species options for radiata pine, are both high priority areas. So what's been happening? In terms of specialty species, over the last 6 years, the major levy investment in developing specialty species has come via the SWP program. This program is a consortium of partners, including FGR and industry, as well as farm forestry, and is matched 50% with co-funding from MB. Collectively, the investment between the partnership and Scion through its SSIF fund represent around $1.4 million per annum. This activity is really focused on creating high-value wood products and regional strategies for durable and non-durable eucalypts, Douglas fir and cypresses. And whilst the program's not holistic in the sense that there are a variety of number of other species that could be included, it's been a highly successful program. The program's ending in 2022, and given changes in funding frameworks, there's no ongoing option for funding via MB. So the question that the partnership program and FGR are now faced with is where to from here. We started that process with a workshop held in Wellington. We got a diverse group of forest owners, processors, government and others together to identify the forces that are both enabling or potentially blocking a future of high-value specialty species. We also talked about how we could imagine a future where specialty species are a natural part of the sector, and focused on identifying key attributes of the various species and where effort could be focused and why. I won't go into the detail of the different workshop activities. However, a key output from that workshop was the strategy diagram presented here. In that diagram, what we look at are some of the things that could be working in our favour and things that are potentially working against us. We looked at it both in the general sense of the forest futures, as well as the growing or the processing sides. And in that, we identified the attributes that we felt were reasonably important for a successful outcome. So as you can see, the ability to predict growth and growth sites and climate conditions was considered to be a high priority for all species in the growing space, whereas tailored genetics to match sites, for example, could be considered a more specific attribute that may or may not be necessary across different species. We also looked at the potential for species to be re-engineered and identified the importance of naturally durable species to create higher value products. In the bottom part of the diagram, we looked at some of the conversations and frameworks that we could undertake to both optimize today's state as well as transforming the sector for tomorrow. This exercise proved useful in the sense that it was a holistic approach independently undertaken from SWP, and therefore allowed a overarching framework to be produced that we could then use to take forward. So in doing so, really the key focus is not to lose momentum. The SWP program has been successful and has come into an end. So we need to make sure that we work towards developing continuity as much as possible. In doing so, FGR is aiming to support and help where appropriate to coordinate the securing of funding for ongoing investment. To do that, what we have undertaken is a continuation of the species review process that was initiated in 2020, and that report's available on the FGR website. We've also used the workshop outputs and the key priority attributes to develop an assessment framework. This is where we are today. The next step is really to circulate and undertake an initial screen using that framework across a large array of species. In doing so, what we're hoping to do is identify a subset of highly ranked species that we can then do a deeper dive and generate a list outlining the specific knowledge gaps by species. And lastly, once we have those attributes identified, we're looking to identify funding partners and develop proposals to take the research forward. And the objective is really to do that, as I said, prior to the end of SWP, which will be at the end of 2022. In terms of the contingency species, I guess the core issue that we're facing is that there is no readily deployable alternative to radiata pine. And there's a fundamental question around whether there needs to be. We see this activity as distinct to specialty species, although potentially related. And that's primarily because the focus of developing a contingency to radiata is one that needs to operate at scale and take into consideration existing supply chains and value chains in a way that establishing new higher value specialty outcomes may not need to do. Similarly to the specialty species, we undertook a workshop in Wellington where we explored the forces shaping our industry's future. We reviewed the potential to control or influence the extent at which a force will shape our sector and discussed the potential to respond through action. This slide identifies some of the higher level unstoppable trends that the group identified influencing today's forestry sector and potentially areas that will be important into the future. So what you can see is some nationalism, some emerging carbon elements, some vulnerability around biosecurity and loss of resilience, the impact of climate change, ownership dynamics, societal expectations and perceptions, the pace of change and disruption occurring globally, the operating practices and health and safety around our people, and the intensification of the primary sector and the associated biosecurity risks that poses. In each of these, we identified pole positions that the sector could find itself in. So, for example, from a societal perspective, we could find ourselves in a position of being a national disgrace where we have low public support, a desire to see fundamental change in practice and potentially an appetite for the industry to diminish. The other end of the spectrum is that we're highly connected to society, where the New Zealand public embrace the contributions that our sector make, both economically, societally, and socially. And similarly for things like climate change, where we're wrestling with predictable climate change that potentially we could foresee into the future versus unpredictable climate change. And in each of those scenarios in bold, we work through potential outcomes that those scenarios may create, in particular as it relates to either a rapid decline of radiata or a gradual decline. And so what you can see across those four axes are some of the summaries that we feel may be present in that future state. And so in doing that, we identified how the industry may respond or the areas that the industry may look to have an evidence base or resources at its disposal. So for example, if you look at the top left corner, what we're dealing with is an acute decline of radiata in response to predictable climate change. And so in that setting, we felt that the industry would experience increased fire, increased tree death, and as a result need to invest in genetic mitigation, potentially explore species options, ensure that there's a robust biosecurity response plan and a ready-to-go resource. However, on the right-hand side, where we're dealing with really unpredictable climate change and acute disruption to radiata, what you can see is much more intense flood, fire, cyclones, pests and landslides, complete disruptive change, at which point the forestry model as it stands today would primarily need to be revisited, with the potential for shorter rotation, new species, an initiative to retrieve the resource that we may have today, and improve measuring and monitoring of climate risks to ensure that unpredictability was better managed. As a result of all those scenarios, the teams then looked at areas where investment may deliver value across multiple attributes, and then prioritize their views of where investment or action could occur. So what you can see here in the top left is that funding and investment, research and science, and information and data were all seen to be important areas, although of slightly different scale. I won't go into the details of those, but basically what we did was we took all of those summaries and we tried to take a framework that we could then identify where action may occur. And again, there's a lot of detail on the slide, so we won't be going into all of the specifics here, but essentially what we said was that there's a role for science to lead, and that's in the bottom part of the graph where we look at the innovation model. And at the top, there's an industry model where industry really needs to engage itself in this area in order to deliver action. And that could potentially be informed by research, but primarily it's going to be the responsibility of the industry itself to explore some of the areas that could prepare for disruption or develop a potentially alternative model to radiata. And so in doing that, we put the different elements on the left-hand side. So those reflect broadly the areas that were identified in the workshop. So things like funding and investment, policy settings, market opportunities, people and society. And down the bottom, some of the more specific areas where science needs to focus its energy. So particularly around things like people and capability, information and data. In terms of next steps, what we're looking to do is engage with our stakeholders to outline the framework. We've already shared the framework with the participants from the workshops, and we've looked for additional refinement and investment in that. In particular, we want to know how we could describe things better. We want to understand what we've missed, and we also want to then take it forward to work out what's already happening today. Once we've done that, we could outline what could be done and by who to materially progress from our current state to our desired state. And ultimately, this is activity that will then help to inform some of the decisions made by the FRC and subsequently, hopefully, the FGLT. So that's a brief overview. I appreciate I've covered a lot of ground and there's a reasonable amount of detail that I skipped over. However, hopefully that gives the attendees a sense for the approach that we're taking in these two important areas and where there may be opportunities for them to participate moving forward. Thanks very much, and I look forward to receiving people's questions.